see you guys in the dark.
It was a summer, right after I graduated from high school. A good friend and I decided to try our hand at camping. We grew up in a greater Los Angeles area, so our knowledge of the great outdoors was nothing beyond the couple of years we had in Cub Scouts of America when we were in elementary school. In other words, we almost had no idea what we were doing. We packed a tent, a couple of sleeping bags, supplies, things like that, and headed off in his car. Note that I grew up in the 80s, so this is a time before the wide prevalence of cell phones and the existence of other portable digital devices. We drove north on the 395 for about 6 hours and then headed westward into the mountains in the area of Inyo Canyon. First mistake, we didn't plan on which place to camp. We played it by ear, like fools. Second mistake, we left in mid-afternoon. It was pitch black, darkness when we arrived in the general area. We had driven off the main road and onto a dirt road in order to find a spot to camp. The dust from driving on the dirt road overwhelmed the headlights' high beams when we finally decided to pull over and set up camp. It was around 23:30 around this time, and we were exhausted and famished. Any place was a good spot to camp for us, given our only reason to do so at that point was our hunger and exhaustion. Third mistake, we didn't bring any flashlights. We only had Bic lighters for our cigarettes. We tried to set up our tent using our lighters and the headlights of the car, which was parked about 10 to 15 feet away from us. The wind was blowing, so the lighter constantly went out after a few seconds, either directly because of the wind, or indirectly because the wind would push the flame into our thumbs. Clearly, we were being complete idiots. We finished setting up the tent, but at that point, I was too tired to eat. My friend managed to make some instant ramen. We smoked a cigarette in the car, and then crashed out in the tent. We woke to a very cold morning. It was around 5:30. Immediately upon exiting the tent, we realized that we were camped at the entrance of a hiking trail. There were at least 2 no camping signs in visible distance from us. We dismantled the tent, cleaned up, and then cleared out. That morning, we ended up buying some cheap flashlights and a nice hot meal in a very small town. It wasn't really a town, but more like a few storefronts and shops on a main road, about the length of an average city block. We went into some office, though I don't really recall exactly what it was. It might have been a park ranger station, or the office headquarters for the campground. In any case, we found and reserved a site for the next night. The campground was basically like a large circle with campsites along its outer circumference, with each campsite being around 50 yards from its neighbor. In the middle of the circle was a common bathroom and a shower. We circled around it once, and I think that we saw one family that was all set up with a tent and a camper. We found our spot and set up camp, which was quite far from them. That night was when we had the creepy encounter. My friend and I were laying in the tent, shining our flashlights upwards and chatting. And our new flashlights eventually gave out. Yes, they broke. Our fire pit was about 6 feet from the opening of our tent, and it was just a glowing ember. We probably should have completely put it out. And we probably shouldn't have had the tent so close. In any case, there we were, chatting away and having a good time. My friend began to be distracted with his foot. After the 3rd or 4th time he got up to check his foot, I asked him what was wrong. He told me that something is tapping his foot from the outside of the tent. His foot was against the side of the tent, so from outside you would have been able to see a bulge in the tent's side where his foot was. It was as if pebbles were being thrown at his feet through the tent. There it is again. What the hell? Each time it happened, there was a sound, like pebbles or a light tap. We sort of laughed it off, assuming it was just a twig or grass moving in the wind, or perhaps a loose strap on the outside of the tent. I don't recall exactly how it happened at first, but I do remember we suddenly became silent at the same time. A sound came to be audible for the both of us, footsteps slowly moving towards our tent. We wondered if it was a bear or another human being, maybe a non-animal. It seemed distinctly bipedal. They were very slow and measured, like a step every 2 seconds. I finally said in a whisper, "Someone's coming." My friend didn't move. His face had an expression of fear. At some point, my friend bolted up and said, "Fuck this." He grabbed his pipe, stuffed it full of pot, and took the biggest, deepest drag that I've ever seen a person take. About a minute or two later, he was out. Drugs weren't my thing, so I was alone in the tent as far as conscious bodies were concerned. I was sitting up at this point, and I had taken out the only weapon that I had, a Swiss Army pocket knife. I took out the big and the small blades, as well as the ice pick in the middle, and held it like some ridiculous melee weapon. I could see the glowing embers in the fire pit just through the sheer nylon materials of our tent, and I was able to roughly, but barely, discern some of the rocks around it. I watched and listened intently. The footsteps came closer, and at the same slow pace, with each step, I could hear the dirt and rocks underfoot crunching and grinding. At some point, it was clear to me that whoever it was standing between the tent and the fireplace. For my fuzzy line of sight to the burning embers through the nylon tent became obscured by something outside the tent. The footsteps stopped right at the front of the tent, about 6 to 8 inches. No more than a foot, from the entrance to the tent at least. It was silent for about a minute, and then I heard a click. At exactly the same time, I clearly saw, through the nylon tent wall, a flashlight turn on. I was able to see not just the flashlight, but the outline of the hand holding it. The flashlight was shining on the zipper entrance into the tent, just inches away from the zipper. Blood drained out of my head, and my palms instantly became dripping wet in sweat. I yelled, "Who's there?" There was some fear in my voice, but it was mostly aggressive in tone. Whoever it was, the person immediately turned off their flashlight. I didn't move, but neither did they. The person just stood there, inches from the tent's only entrance. My friend is out, totally unaware of what's going on. Nevertheless, I pretended that he was still awake and whispered just loud enough to be audible to our visitor. "Yes, loaded. There's one in the chamber," as if my friend was awake and asked me about our gun. My fourth mistake. We didn't have a gun or any real weapon for self-defense. It felt like an eternity, but after sitting still for at least 10 minutes, I heard feet slowly turning in the dirt, then slowly walking away from the tent. I stayed up that whole night, and it wasn't until the light of dawn came through the tent that I crashed out. The heat inside the tent woke us up, and it was near noon by this point. We went outside to inspect the site, but found nothing missing. However, we did find a boot prints leading away from our campsite and outside the campground. That was the last time that I went and camped in a tent. This happened 2 years ago, August 11th of 2018, and since the anniversary just passed, I thought that I should finally share this story. My fiancé and I were on the second night of our 2-night camping trip at a popular campground about a half an hour away from where we live. For reference, my fiancé is black. We live in a predominantly white, conservative, and racist area. This is important for later. Our first night, we kept hearing noises in the woods around us. The campsite right beside ours to the right was occupied, but the one to the left was not. The campsites are about 150 yards apart, and we had camped here in the same exact plot the year before. Needless to say, we were familiar with the area and the various kinds of animals that live in the woods. The first night, we heard shuffling around our tent. It was obviously something large moving around. We brushed it off and assumed it was just a deer. Now back to the main event. On August 11th, we spent the day at the battlefields a town over with my family. They had all been invited to join us for the day by my fiancé, as a surprise for me while he proposed to me. We stayed with my family into the evening, which was around 6 p.m., before heading back to our campsite. When we got back, things were really odd. Someone had obviously been in our tent. Our blankets were thrown around, clothes were on the floor, and my backpack had been rearranged, and I was missing some underwear. But hey, we were stupid 19-year-olds, and decided that since whoever had busted in had left and hadn't taken anything important, it was fine, and they wouldn't come back. So we set up a campfire and sat out until it was dark, roasting hot dogs and s'mores, smoking cigarettes and celebrating our engagement. Around 9:30 p.m., we put out our fire and decided to go into our tent for the night to celebrate a little bit more. Nothing too loud or obnoxious. Immediately after we finished, we started to hear the noises outside of our tent again, but this time we focused in. We heard clear footsteps, and at one point, a man whispering. We looked at each other, and our eyes got wide. Someone was definitely walking around outside of our tent. We were still and completely silent, just listening to the footsteps, and we heard the whispering again. Shit. Make that 2 men walking around our tent. As if we had the ability to read minds, my fiancé says, "I have to go to the bathroom," and I agreed. The bathroom was just up the hill from our site. Most people who were in lower sites, like ours, drove their cars up to the bathroom. Now here's the part that I still get chills thinking about. We got up and were getting dressed. My fiancé had just turned on the light in our tent and put his binder on when a man spoke directly to us from right outside of the tent. "What are you doing?" I can't even describe how malicious and menacing this voice sounded. It was clearly directed at us, and he said it with a snicker. He was watching us through the walls of the tent. Again, for this part, we were stupid 19-year-olds, so we decided to just run for it to the car. My fiancé grabbed his pocket knife and his keys, stepped out of the tent. He pulled me with him, and we ran like hell to the car. I heard the footsteps running behind us, and then turning and running to another campsite. At the bathroom, we talked over our options. We talked about sleeping in the car or driving into town. Then we had another idea. We drove back down to the campsite and began packing everything into the car. At this point, it was around midnight. We moved faster than I think either of us thought possible, wrapping up the tent with our belongings still in it, and grabbing our folding chairs. We were all packed in 5 minutes and hopped into the car to leave. I jumped out at the end of the driveway and grabbed our nameplate, which had full names on it, off of that post. As we pulled out of the campsite, I saw our assailants for the first time, stalking through the woods onto our campsite where 2 tall white men were. I realized that they were the same men who had been driving past our campsite the whole time we were there, just glaring at us and muttering to each other. One was wearing camo hunting gear, and the other was wearing a Confederate flag tank top. Both were carrying large hunting knives, unsheathed and at the ready. They turned when they saw our car driving away, and one started to make chase until the other one stopped him. I made eye contact with the man in camo, and he smiled the most terrifyingly evil smile at me and shook his head slowly. We drove the long way home, taking all the weirdest, hardest to follow roads, and called my dad so that he would know we were coming home. When we got home, we told my dad everything, and he shrugged it off as us being paranoid. So I never told anyone else besides all of you now. I am convinced to this day that this was going to be a racial-motivated attack. The campground was not heavily populated, and my fiancé was the only non-white person at any of the campsites. It was no accident that the 2 men who had been shadowing us since our arrival and wore Confederate flags and had one on their truck decided to target the interracial couple. I still get cold chills when I think about how close we were to being killed or seriously hurt that night, and just how lucky we were that our reckless plan to make a run for it worked. So to those men who stalked our campsite with the hunting knives, I really hope that we don't meet again.
If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, like, and hit the bell for notifications on future videos, and become a stalker of the night. And I'll see you next time.